Welcome everyone to Aionics Fortnightly, episode 35. This is our first episode of 2024, and it's really an honor to do it with one of our own, with Dr. Solomon Oyakhire, scholar in residence at Aionics, and Schmidt postdoc at UC Berkeley. We're going to be talking about two topics that are near and dear to both of our hearts, which is data-driven science and electrolytes. So very excited about this. Before we go any further, Solomon, let me first, I should call you Dr. Oyakhire. I'm too used to calling you Solomon. First of all, welcome to Aionics Fortnightly.
Solomon. Solomon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, super excited to just jump right in. As everyone knows, I'm sure, Aionics has been focused on machine learning and data-driven science from the beginning, and we've been focused on electrochemistry and electrolytes specifically. And so when I first saw your paper, which came out, when was that? That was probably
last year.
Last year. Yeah. So when I first saw that paper, I was super excited because this was just right up our alley, and we actually had been making extensive use of it internally before you even joined the team. So when there was an opportunity to have you join us as a scholar in residence, it was just too perfect. So excited for you to present this work for us and to talk through it. Maybe I should give you a little bit of a bio and introduction for everyone before I hand it off to you, so everyone knows who you are. So I mentioned that Solomon is a Schmidt Science Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Berkeley, where he's working with, I would say, two of the top names in materials informatics, Professors Christine Persson and Gerd Cedar. Was a PhD student at Stanford with Professor Ichwei, who was one of my co-advisors as well. So I guess that makes us academic brothers. And another fun sort of trivia is that one of your co-authors on the paper you're going to be discussing was Konstantin Athanidis, who was also an Aionics intern a couple of years ago. And so I think it was just meant to be that we were going to work together. So he worked with Professor Choi as well as Professor Stacy Bent at Stanford, and focused on surface science and machine learning for understanding reactivity and electron transfer in energy and electrochemical systems. I should mention that he's incoming faculty at Georgia Tech in 2025 or 2026? 5. Okay, so we're lucky to grab him at Aionics as a scholar in residence for this 2-year period between Stanford and his faculty work. I should mention that as a scholar in residence, he's working with us part-time. Most of his time is spent at UC Berkeley, but the time he does spend with us, we're really grateful to have him, as a voice in the room, thinking about small data strategies and various ways to, accelerate the design of battery components at Aionics in industry, which is what we're focused on. Last point here is that he holds a bachelor's in chemical engineering with highest honors from the University of Lagos, which is where he's from originally. And with that, I'm happy to hand the floor over to you, Solomon. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in. And if this is your first time joining us at Aionics Fortnightly, welcome. I would just remind you that we like to keep this fun and sort of informal and conversational. So if anyone has questions as we go, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I'll sort of moderate and jump in. And Solomon, I might cut you off and ask some questions as they come up, and then we'll also have time at the end as well. So if anyone wants to save their questions, that's fine too. So with all that being said, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Austin. Can you see my slides okay?
Yep.
Nice.
Perfect.
But that was a great, probably one of the best introductions I've ever received in my entire life and career. So I'm very grateful for that. My name is Solomon Oyakhire, as Austin just mentioned. I'm a Schmidt Science Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Berkeley, and I'm really thrilled to be here today to present some of the work that I did as a PhD student at Stanford that was focused on data-driven electrolyte design for lithium metal batteries. So before we delve into the science and the electrolyte design, I think it's useful to set the stage by reminding everyone that there's an ever-pressing need to reduce anthropogenic emissions. And I don't know if this tab is obstructing people's view. Can you How does
No,
this thing?
you're fine. We just see a blank slide.
Oh, I see. Okay, cool, great. Well, there's an ever-pressing need to reduce anthropogenic emissions. And when you think about the breakdown of anthropogenic emissions, you'll observe that a large fraction of the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions comes from the energy sector. And this often takes various forms, from energy use in industry to energy use in buildings and energy use in transportation. As a result, there's been a systematic shift towards the use of green alternatives to a lot of these common energy technologies. And I'm showing some of these alternatives here, where I'm depicting that there's been a proliferation in the use of solar panels for generating energy. There's also been an increase in the adoption of electric vehicles for transportation. And these new green technologies are all very beneficial for the planet, but they all have a common theme between the intermittence of the sun and between the need for long driving ranges on electric vehicles. There's a common requirement of reliable energy storage devices that connects these green technologies together. Unfortunately for us today, one energy storage device that has the potential to actually transform energy storage in these green technologies is the class of batteries called lithium metal batteries. And the potential of lithium metal batteries is depicted on the left here, where I'm showing the modeled cell energy density as a function of different cathode materials for two classes of batteries: conventional lithium ion batteries that are present in our phones and computers today, in comparison to lithium metal batteries. And the quick takeaway from this plot is that regardless of the cathode material, lithium metal batteries have a modeled cell energy density that consistently is higher than the cell energy density of lithium ion batteries, showing us that they have immense energy storage potential. And the reason for this is quite simple, and I'm depicting that now on the right, where I'm showing the cell architecture for lithium metal batteries in comparison to lithium ion batteries. And you'll observe that within these two architectures, most of the components are essentially the same. The cathode and the separator can be the same. But the key change here between these two batteries is that lithium-ion batteries, the carbonaceous anode in lithium-ion batteries, is replaced by pure lithium metal in lithium metal batteries. And because the carbon doesn't exactly, the graphite here doesn't exactly contribute positively to the energy density of the battery, we're able to access unprecedented energy densities with lithium metal batteries, making them the holy grail for energy storage. But this blessing of lithium metal batteries often comes with a curse, because lithium is really reactive, and the reactivity of lithium metal is depicted on this redox table here, where you observe that lithium is at the bottom of this table with a very low redox potential. And what this really means is that lithium prefers to be in the oxidized state, so it is a very strong reducing agent. And this can be very problematic in a battery, and I'm going to show you how just in a bit. When the battery undergoes charging, here I'm depicting battery charging in the presence of a copper working electrode and a liquid electrolyte, lithium ions get transported towards this copper working electrode. When they reach the vicinity of the copper working electrode, they receive electrons from copper towards the reduction of these lithium ions into lithium metal. And in an ideal scenario, the amount of lithium that you formed during your charging process will be available for you during the discharge process, leading to preservation of the battery capacity over multiple different cycles. But as we just established here on this plot, lithium actually likes to reduce whatever it comes in contact with. So what actually happens in the presence of lithium metal and a liquid electrolyte is that lithium wants to donate its electrons towards the electrolyte, towards the decomposition of this electrolyte. And when this decomposition happens, you form this green interfacial film that I'm depicting here. And this formation of this interfacial film also is often accompanied by the loss of lithium metal. And you can see how this becomes a challenge for lithium metal batteries. If during every cycle, you lose the active material that's responsible for the energy density of the battery, then you have a precipitous decline in the capacity of the battery. And this often shows up in practical terms, like what I'm showing here. So on the left here, I'm showing the Coulombic efficiency of a lithium metal battery as a function of cycle index. And you might wonder what Coulombic efficiency is. It's essentially a metric that represents what we just discussed on the previous slide. It's a metric that captures the amount of lithium that's available during discharge as a fraction of the amount of lithium that was deposited during the charging process. And in an ideal case, you would want this to be as close to 100% for as long as possible in the battery. But in the case of actual lithium metal batteries, as a result of these rapid reactions of lithium metal batteries, you observe a continuous decline in this Coulombic efficiency. And this is terrible for the battery for obvious reasons. You lose capacity and the energy density of the battery reduces. And for a more concrete example of this, how this could actually play out in the battery used in today's devices or electric vehicles, I'm showing a depiction here. So imagine you bought an electric vehicle that contains a lithium metal battery. On the first day, what this plot is telling us is that you might be able to access 300 miles of your driving range after fully charging your battery. But if you have a lithium metal battery whose capacity drops precipitously like is depicted here, what you could observe after full charge on the 30th day is that you're only able to access 100 miles on a full charge, showing us that this reactivity is really a very strong practical problem for lithium metal batteries. As such, lots of different strategies have been deployed for addressing the reactivity of lithium metal. And I'm going to show you two of the most successful strategies here. The first is centered on the modification of the growth structures of lithium. And here I'm showing two different possible growth structures of lithium. On the top part of this panel, these lithium particles have higher contact area, and you typically want to prevent this from happening. So there's been a systematic shift towards the change of lithium growth structures from these high surface area structures towards this compact low surface area structures, with the core idea being that if you can reduce the contact area between lithium and the electrolyte, then you can reduce the extent of reaction and the associated loss of lithium capacity in the battery. And that's been a very successful strategy in lithium metal battery literature. Another strategy that's also very effective is the use of interfacial films, the modification of interfacial films that effectively isolate the reactive surface of lithium metal from the electrolyte. By changing the chemistry and the structure of this interfacial film, you can vary the extent of modification and increase the Coulombic efficiency of lithium metal batteries. One key thing to observe here is that these two strategies can be implemented by modifications in the electrolyte. So for instance, if you want to reduce the likelihood of forming these dendritic high surface area structures, you can modify the transport of the electrolyte to reduce the likelihood of having a concentration gradient close to the surface of the working electrode. Similarly, to change the chemistry and the structure of this interfacial film that forms on the surface of lithium metal, you can modify the chemistry of the electrolyte, and that would ultimately affect the types of interfacial films that you form, making it very clear that the foundation of the most successful strategies for improving Coulombic efficiency in a battery and reducing the reactivity of lithium metal are very strongly connected to the liquid electrolyte in the battery. So it should come as no surprise when I tell you that electrolyte engineering has supercharged the improvements in lithium metal battery efficiency. And here I'm showing a plot of Coulombic efficiency of lithium metal batteries over the past few decades. And what you observe is that there's been an increase in Coulombic efficiency over the past few decades that can be attributed to changes in electrolyte chemistry. You observe here that electrolytes are very often varied from different classes, all the way from carbonates to ethers and some localized high concentration electrolytes that are the staple of today's electrolyte engineering. Well, it really saddens me to say that despite the importance of electrolyte engineering for improving the Coulombic efficiency of lithium metal batteries, electrolytes today are still by and large discovered by trial and error. And to make this clear to you, I'm going to distill that plot that I just showed into the core discoveries over the past 5 decades. You observe that if you extract the key information from this plot, you will observe that we've only been able to discover less than 500 unique and stable electrolyte mixtures over the past 5 decades. In addition to this, we've only been able to discover and introduce less than 20 unique stable salts on the surface of lithium metal. Due to the importance of electrolytes in the stability and the stabilization of lithium metal batteries, I think we can establish that the importance of electrolytes in emission reduction actually warrants faster rates of discovery of new electrolytes for passivation of lithium metal batteries. And that was the central discovery and the central motivation for this work, which led to this question: can we build interpretable models, machine learning models, that accelerate the discovery and design of new electrolytes? Hopefully, this part of the question is clear. The discovery and design of new electrolytes part is clear. But the interpretability constraints that we impose on this question really stems from the fact that we wanted to generate models that actually that had physics incorporated into them to enable the further proliferation and discovery of new electrolytes. So before answering this question for ourselves, we tried to look into the literature for all the methods that are available for new material discovery. And one of the most common methods is distilled air. This is the so-called funnel method, and it's one of the most common and one of the most successful methods for new materials discovery. And it's centered around a systematic exploration of using deep learning to screen materials, and then using physics-based methods to screen the outputs of the deep learning step towards the synthesis and the characterization of new materials that help us generate insights. As beautiful as this funnel method is, as a result of certain constraints that are imposed on our particular study, it's difficult for us to apply this method for our own goals here. And the specific constraints are listed here. The first is that we want interpretable models. Now, by definition, deep learning methods are not very interpretable. The other thing is that we have less than 500 unique electrolytes, making it really complicated and challenging for us to use complicated methods like deep learning that often require large amounts of data sets. The other thing is that to the best of our knowledge, and up until this point, there is no exact physics-based tool that can help us calculate CE based on the features of electrolytes, making this method, as beautiful and elegant as it is, really difficult for us to apply. So we had to come up with a new method. And our new approach for electrolyte discovery was founded on one key insight, which is the fact that we believe very strongly at the beginning of this work that the Coulombic efficiency of a battery can be expressed as a function of the electrolyte features. Starting with this key assumption and this key hypothesis, we then designed a workflow that adopts the benefits of this key assumption. So here, the first step of our workflow is to actually extract script data from the literature. And this amounted to about 150 unique entries where we extract the electrolyte formula and the Coulombic efficiency associated with all these different electrolyte formulae in the literature. The other thing that we did was impose our constraints of interpretability, ensuring that we end up using only linear regression models or tree-based methods. And as you can see from linear regression, it becomes very evident how each of these factors, each of these features affects Coulombic efficiency and in what direction they affect Coulombic efficiency. Using the outputs of our interpretable model, we're then able to rigorously verify statistically the output of this model and also experimentally the outputs of this model towards generating new insights that enable us to generate new electrolytes and design new electrolytes. So before we go further in this work, I think we need to think very critically about this key assumption that we made here, because this key assumption is going to play a role in what we discover and what we do next. So we assume that Coulombic efficiency is a function of electrolyte features, suggesting to us that whatever model that we build here can only rise to the level of the efficacy of the features that we select for capturing the variance of Coulombic efficiency, which makes the feature selection process a really crucial process in our work. So before we selected features, we went back to the initial drivers of CE. What makes CE change in an electrolyte, in a battery? Well, we've identified that two of the critical drivers are the modification of lithium growth structure and the modification of interfacial film on the surface of lithium. How do we connect these observations to foundational and molecular properties in the electrolyte? Well, these features can be modified by changing things like lithium ion transport, changing the interfacial film chemistry afforded by the electrolyte, and also changing the reaction energy, because then that could modulate the kinetics of decomposition of the electrolyte in the presence of lithium. The central realization to these three molecular properties is that they can be connected to electrolyte composition. And I'm depicting the details of that here. So by capturing things like the percentage of fluorine, oxygen, and carbon in the electrolyte, in a sense, all of these should be loosely connected to the viscosity of the electrolyte, and that then affects ion transport. Similarly, by capturing the ratio of the different elements in the electrolyte, we capture the likelihood of incorporation of these different elements in this interfacial film. So they should help us explain some of the physics of the film chemistry in this battery. And also very similarly, by capturing the number of solvent oxygen atoms, we hypothesized that those features could actually help us understand the likelihood of decomposing and reducing lithium ions at different potentials in the battery. Using this assumptions and these features, we were able to generate about 14 features that could actually help us explain Coulombic efficiency in the battery. And this is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because now we have a lot of features to select from. It's a curse for two reasons. One is that the central aim of our work is to be able to go into the lab and modulate some of these features towards actually changing electrolyte efficiency. And that becomes challenging when you want to modulate 14 features simultaneously. The second challenge is that I identified previously in the previous slide that we had only 150 unique entries of electrolytes in this work. By definition, as you increase the complexity of models, as you increase the number of features, you increase the likelihood of overfitting, making it very challenging for us to use all 14 features to build a reliable model. So the first and most important stage for this machine learning and this data-driven work was to actually reduce the number of features. And we opted to use a method called forward stepwise selection for that purpose. And here we started with 14 features, and the simple method associated with the simple sequence of steps associated with forward stepwise selection is that you start off with a model that is based on a relationship between the Coulombic efficiency and none of these features. So it's an empty model. And you can imagine that for an empty model, you end up having the highest possible prediction error because you're not relating CE to any of these features. What forward stepwise selection then does is that it sequentially increases the number of features present in the model by figuring out which of these features within our feature pool reduces the prediction error by the largest amount in comparison to the other features. So here, if we were to run this process, an example of what could actually, an outcome of this process is that CE then becomes represented as a function of only one feature. And here, the idea here is that this feature in comparison to all these other features reduces the predictive error when going from the empty model to the one feature model. And the similar thing applies as you increase the number of features. With forward stepwise selection, you're not only able to reduce the number of features, but you're also able to balance this prediction error in such a way that you have a small feature set with reliable prediction error. And this is exactly how this plays out in our own particular work, where I'm showing the regression features included in our work as a function of number of features. And what you observe is that as we increase the number of features, all these features become systematically included. The first key observation here is that when we restrict the number of features to only one feature, the solvent oxygen, which is a fraction of the number of oxygen atoms that are present in the entire electrolyte that are restricted to the solvent, that becomes one of the most important features in our model for achieving high predictive power. And similarly, as we apply this forward stepwise selection, the residual sum of squares reduces, as you would expect. The prediction error reduces as the complexity of the model increases. But this is also quite deceiving because as we increase the number of features, we also increase the likelihood of overfitting models. So one of the key steps here was to ensure that this smaller model that we've just established actually is generalizable across unseen and across test data. And to assess generalizability, we use two methods: cross-validation and Bayesian information criterion. And without going into the details of these methods, the key point that we're trying to observe here is we're assessing generalizability using two distinct pathways. And the generalizability in this case is a function of how low the cross-validation error is and how low the Bayesian information criterion estimate is. And what you observe from both plots is that the four-feature model gives us one of the most generalizable models across both metrics. And this is what that four-feature model looks like, where we're expressing efficiency as a very simple linear combination of four features: the solvent oxygen, so the amount, again, like I explained in the previous slide, the amount of oxygen that is located on the solvent, the fluorine to oxygen ratio, the inorganic to organic ratio. So by definition, we defined some elements as being the major constituents of the inorganic species that form an interfacial film. And we divided by the organic species that form an interfacial film. We also have the anion carbon. So we've established that these models appear to be generalizable. So we decided to apply a bunch of additional statistical tests to ensure that these models are indeed reliable. And one of such statistical tests is shown here, where we're testing this 4-feature model in the training and the test data sets, and we're plotting the predicted efficiency as a function of the observed efficiency, measured efficiencies in those reported papers in the literature. In an ideal scenario, all of these points would lie on this 45-degree line, showing a perfect match between predictions and observations. But we see here that even though these points deviate from the 45-degree mark, they still lie reasonably close, and their residuals lie very close to zero, suggesting that this 4-feature linear model actually is reliable in a sense. In addition to this, we used another statistical metric called the variance inflation factor, which captures the collinearity between the features in our final model. And the reason why collinearity is important is that you want to ensure that your features are not collinear with each other to ensure that they explain different aspects of the variance of your target variable. In this case, that's Coulombic efficiency. And the threshold for variance inflation factor is a value of 5. So if you have features that have variance inflation factors that exceed the value of 5, you typically tend to discard those features because they don't provide additional value to the model. What you observe here is that for all of our features, the variance inflation factor is less than a value of 2, suggesting that these models, this model is indeed very reliable. But we weren't really satisfied with only a statistical test. We decided to push and test this model significantly further by testing on new electrolytes. And by new electrolytes, what I mean here is that we selected 13 new electrolytes that were not included in the training or the testing data sets. And to make sure that this test was as rigorous as possible, we included the constraint of molecular diversity by adding 3 different classes of solvents within these new electrolytes to see how likely this model is to perform when you have molecularly diverse species and solvents in the electrolyte. So here we're showing the predicted efficiency in the presence of this model for these 13 electrolytes as a function of what we actually measured in lab. And again, you observe that a lot of our predictions lie very close to the measurements, suggesting to us that we can actually take a breather now because this selected model is reliable. Knowing that the selected model is reliable, we can then begin to dig deeper into the model to extract insights from the model that help us design new electrolytes. And one of such ways for extracting insights is this process called the importance of selected features. So we have 4 features, and the process of importance, the process of identifying importance really boils down to identifying which of these features is the most important and ranking them in order of importance. And one way to do that is to use decision trees by building decision trees with all 4 features and excluding each of these features from the decision tree. We can see how the predictive power of the decision tree varies in the absence of these features. And I'm showing what that result looks like on the right here, where you observe a mean squared error increase in the absence of each of these features. In the absence of the AC feature, the mean squared error increases by about 10%. Meanwhile, in the absence of the SO feature, the mean squared error increases by about 50%, suggesting that the SO feature is the most critical to accurate predictions of Coulombic efficiency, boiling down to the fact that SO is the most important feature. And this really served as a point of surprise in this work, where I actually went back and started doing the code all over again frantically to make sure that we weren't mislabeling or miscoding something at some point. And the main reason why the key conclusion from this slide was almost a cause for concern at the initial point of discovery was that in the past few decades, the bulk of electrolyte engineering has been focused on tweaking a particular element, and that's fluorine. So we expected that this work will lead to the revelation that fluorine is the most important part, the most important component that needs to be tweaked in the electrolyte. So this actually helped us rethink a lot of the narrative around fluorine. Maybe fluorine actually and its effects is actually a symptom of an underlying molecular factor in the electrolyte. So we decided to use SO to try to explain old data with the
So
key.
Solomon, can
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't want to break your flow, but
Yeah,
I'm
please,
trying
please,
I was
please.
trying to find the best point to jump in because we have some good questions I think are about this like feature engineering point.
Okay, okay.
Um, so
Yeah,
I'm super curious about what you're about to say, but I
yeah,
before we went too far down the road, I wanted to ask. So we had one question about the process of feature engineering
yeah,
from
yeah.
Taiwu who asks I guess about the role of physics. So like, can you build the model or the features in such a way that they um, preserve sort of physical phenomena? They mentioned conservation of charge or energy, or maybe
Mm.
just like more broadly, they could ask like, how do you think about the role of physics in the feature and model building process?
Yeah, I think the role of physics cannot be denied, and that was one of the intents behind the careful selection of some of these features. But like I will show later at the end of this slide, these features do not actually encode fully or distinctly all of these physical terms that might actually be important for changing Coulombic efficiency. So one way you can actually address some of the deficits of the models and the features that we selected here is by using DFT to calculate some of these things that we think are important for Coulombic efficiency. Because then by calculating physical terms that are associated with these solvents, we can make generalizable claims across multiple different classes of solvents. And to make that even more significantly clearer, if you look at SO as a feature, it's very possible to have two solvents, isomers of each other with very similar SOs, but very different Coulombic efficiencies, because SO doesn't exactly encode explicitly for some of those additional physical implications in the solvent. So yes, I think you're very right that some of the next steps associated with work like this is to actually encode the relevant physics in these features and in feature engineering. And I have a
Yeah.
slide at the end that I think you will like as well, and Ty
Okay.
will also like.
I'm excited. Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's, I think, also ties into Tim's question, which is about activity coefficients. Was that in your feature list?
I I did not, and I wish I could, but
Yeah.
again, this I think one of the key points of this work was just very similar to what you did during your PhD, Austin, with the solid electrolyte stuff, was to observe if there's any signal associated with these electrolyte features, right? This served as the most
Right.
basic way of checking if there's signal. And now we hopefully, right? I think we're on the right slide for this. We should actually then lead to an offshoot of different trees and branches and nodes of different approaches that are based on the idea that electrolyte features contain some signals. So how do we encode the relevant physics to make sure that this all of the physics and the features and carry as much power in the prediction of Coulombic efficiency? But these are great questions. I love this
Yeah.
discussion. I'm happy to take this offline.
Yeah, yeah. The great thing about data-driven modeling, as my late great advisor, Professor Evan Reed, used to say, is that like you really hope that you're proven wrong someday because that
Mhm.
just means that someone's figured out a better model than you,
That's right.
right? So it's either you're right and then that's great, or you're wrong and we've gotten better at what we're trying to do. So it's sort of like a win-win.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
think Evan was a very wise man because what he said is very similar to what George Box said, right? All models are wrong, but some are useful. So we hope to preserve the use of
yeah,
these models until we find models that are better than these ones, and hopefully we can move on
that's
from
right.
and continue to advance the field. I think there's
That's
another
right.
question in the chat box here, in the Q&A box. I don't know, from Rasha. You
Yeah,
think
one from
can I
Lenson and
address
one
that
from
very
Russia.
quickly?
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, well, the one from Russia, yes. So we tried to address for that. If you recall early on, I said that there were about 500 unique mixtures, but then we ended up using only 150 unique mixtures in our study. And that was because we tried to constrain the types of cell configuration. So we had lithium copper cells tested around the same, are using the same electrodes, the same separator, and under very similar conditions. That's what ultimately constrained our data sets into 150. So we tried to account for that. But that's a great question.
Yeah, and for the listeners listening after the just to be clear, the question is about variations in the cell parameters, electrode thickness, and things like that. So
Yeah.
Solomon saying that they just controlled for that. Final question that we have in this batch is from Lenson, which is about cross validation and the importance of grouping in those what do you call them, in the groups of points that are validated against each other. Can you share anything about the cross-validation strategy that you used?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great point, Lenson. And I think what Lenson is getting at, also correct me if I'm wrong here, Lenson, is that depending on how you split these data points, it's very likely that you obtain certain fractions of the data that are very distinct from the other data points because you have a very small data set. So what we tried to do here was, rather than using one instance of cross-validation, we generated multiple different random samplings of different instances and splits, and use the average cross-validation error to actually to inform the subsequent parts of our studies. But yeah, that's a question that only people that have actually delved deeply into small data sets would ask. But that's a great question.
Great, thanks. And actually, we just had one more come in,
Yeah.
so I'll release you to continue in 1 second. So this last question is, so since some of the top features are oxygen and fluorine, what would
Yeah.
be the role of nitrogen? So what's predicted for nitriles? And then what about salt? So did you see anything in terms of salt concentrations? Actually, first question is the salt
Yeah.
concentration a factor? And then how did that come into play?
Yeah, I mean, you can think about salt concentration from a perspective. So let's think about SO, yeah, and what SO represents, right? SO is a fraction of oxygen present in the solvent as a ratio of the entire number of atoms and moles within your electrolyte. So we can argue that in a sense, our features actually capture for changes in salt concentration. So let me present this in a more logical way. What people have observed in the past few years is that when you increase salt concentration, you have an increase in Coulombic efficiency. So that would be tantamount to a reduction in SO if you factor in what I just explained. So there is no explicit way of capturing the salt concentration, but it is baked into some of these features if you think about it really critically. But again, the anonymous attendee can go on and then develop features that explicitly account for concentration and help us encode that more effectively in this work. Okay.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Please feel free to continue.
Thank you. Great discussion, great questions. Very, very pleased to chat about this. So we've established that SO appears to be the most important feature, and because of how shocking this was, we decided to see if SO could actually help us explain some of the data in the past. Let's see, is my slide working? With the idea being that low SO should correlate with increased CE. So let's go back to this plot and break this plot down into 3 different regimes. The CE regime between 80 and 90%, the CE regime between 90 and 98%, and the CE regime above 98%. And let's also try to extract some of the most common solvents in each of those regimes and calculate SO for each of those solvents. So here, if you observe in the 80 to 90% regime, the most common solvent is ethylene carbonate, and its SO is around 0.3. If you go into the 90 to 98% regime, ether solvents are very common, with one of the most common representatives being dimethoxyethane. And you observe here that between these 2 CE regimes, there's a reduction in SO that's in agreement with some of the findings that we've discovered so far in this work. And if you push this even further and you go into the highest of the highest Coulombic efficiencies, you'll observe that the diethoxyethanes of the world have even lower SO, showing that low SO does correlate strongly with increased CEs. So how can we use this finding and this insight to actually design new electrolytes? We start off with the starting point that a known average performing solvent is dimethoxyethane, and it has this SO value. And with new solvents, we then began to design new solvents based on some of these structures, these similar structures. And you observe that with solvents like the methyl-butyl ether, our SO is significantly lower than the SO in dimethoxyethane. We also come up with an isomeric variant of this, the methyl-tert-butyl ether and dibutyl ethers, all of which with the same salt will be predicted by our model to be high-performing electrolytes. So we set out to actually verify some of these predictions of these models based on these design insights that led to the discovery of these new electrolytes. And to measure the efficiency of the electrolytes, we use a method called the Orbach test for 2 reasons. The first reason being that with the bulk of our training and test data, those electrolytes were tested using the Orbach test. The second reason being that with the Orbach method, because you have this preconditioning step in which you deposit and you dissolve lithium, you're able to abstract away some of the problems associated with impurities on the surface of the current collector. And the second additional layer to the benefit of the OBAC test is that because you have a reservoir of lithium deposited during the cycling process, and you actually try to dissolve all of it at the end of the cycling process, you're able to observe not just the effectiveness of charge transfer in the presence of these electrolytes, but you're also able to assess the reactivity of these electrolytes when you have a lithium reservoir that's just left in the battery for about a few days. So with this test and the rigor of this test, we're able to show that a lot of these 4 electrolytes that we just discussed and discovered have Coulombic efficiencies that outpace a lot of the reported Coulombic efficiencies in the literature, showing us that this ML-informed strategy and these ML-informed electrolytes cycle with record high efficiency. But we weren't satisfied with just showing the community that we could discover new electrolytes that perform really well. We wanted to understand why these electrolytes perform really well. And to understand why these electrolytes perform well, we can go back to those 2 points that we discussed earlier. The first is, can we look at lithium growth? We discussed that if you can reduce the contact area between lithium and the electrolyte, you should, in principle, reduce the extent of reaction between lithium and the electrolyte and improve Coulombic efficiency. So we set out to actually look at the lithium growth structures in 2 electrolytes, the known average performing electrolyte and our high-performing solvent, our high-performing electrolyte. And we use scanning electron microscopy to look at the lithium growth structures in these 2 electrolytes, and you observe that the structures are pretty stark. On the average performing electrolytes, the lithium structures are very grainy and high surface area, consistent with this structure that we depict here. And in the case of our high-performing electrolyte, the lithium structures are very compact, suggesting that this high-performing electrolyte forms low contact area of lithium particles, as would be consistent with an improvement in Coulombic efficiency. The other layer to investigate here is efficiency improvements associated with the interfacial film. We discussed very early on that you can improve the efficiency of the lithium metal battery by purposefully designing interfacial films that effectively isolate the surface of lithium from the electrolyte. So we investigated the interfacial chemistry of this interfacial film formed in 2 different electrolytes. And the key takeaway from this plot, before actually getting lost in all of the details and the elements that we have here, is that you have a higher presence of species like sulfur, oxygen, and fluorine as a ratio to carbon in the presence of the high-performing electrolyte in comparison to the low or the average performing electrolyte, suggesting that this high-performing electrolyte forms a lot of these inorganic rich interfacial film species. You might wonder, why exactly are these inorganic rich species beneficial for lithium metal battery? Well, in the literature, people have shown extensively that when you form species that contain things like lithium oxide and lithium fluoride, you're able to form very high band gap materials at this interface that prevent the shuttling of electrons from lithium to the electrolyte, thereby reducing the decomposition of the electrolyte. And that was very, very interesting to see. The other thing that was also interesting to investigate along the lens of interfacial film is interfacial film structure. So on the left here, I'm showing TEM images, transmission electron microscopy images of the interfacial film and the structure of that interfacial film that forms on lithium metal in the presence of the average performing electrolyte. You observe a 9 nanometer film formed in the average performing electrolyte. Meanwhile, when you look at the higher performing electrolyte, the interfacial film is much thinner and appears to be more uniform, suggesting that this high performing electrolyte forms a thinner and a more uniform solid electrolyte interface. This SEI is what I've been referring to so far as the interfacial film. Again, you try to ask a question, why exactly is the thinner SEI or the uniform SEI better for the surface of lithium particles? Let's think about what lithium transport, what the battery charging and discharging process entails. It entails a lot of shuttling of lithium ions across the domains of the SEI. When you have a thinner SEI, that shuttling process becomes more facile because the resistance to the transport of ions reduces substantially. And when you have a uniform SEI, you have a uniform likelihood of shuttling lithium ions across all of the domains of the SEI, reducing the likelihood that the SEI fractures as a result of an increase in mechanical flux at a particular region of the SEI. Making all of this is consistent with the idea that in the presence of these high-performing electrolytes, we should observe an improvement in coulombic efficiency. This is all nice and good, but this doesn't really tell us what SO really represents at a molecular level in the electrolyte. What we've shown so far is that you can improve coulombic efficiency by reducing the lithium contact area and improving the interfacial film that forms on the surface of lithium metal. We've also shown that these two things can be achieved by reducing SO in the electrolyte. But what we haven't shown is what SO really means for the electrolyte. So to answer that question, we tried to dig deep into the literature to see if there had been observations that were consistent with this and linked to molecular properties of the electrolyte. And we did find something. Something we found was that in this particular study, weak solvation of the electrolyte had been correlated with an improvement or reduction in lithium contact area. Here we're showing that weak solvation leads to the formation of these compact lithium particles as a result of the fact that when you have weak solvation, the voltage at which lithium is deposited is much higher. So you have a reduction in the concentration of negative charges on the surface of lithium. And then that reduces the likelihood that you form dendrites and increases the likelihood that you grow from the lithium particles that were deposited to begin with. This was interesting that we were able to make this connection between weak solvation and lithium contact area. Another interesting thing in the literature was that people had also made, in a different study, in a completely independent study, made a connection between weak solvation and improvements in interfacial films. And when you think about the role of oxygen on the solvent and how it helps to separate the charges on the cation and the anion, it's very logical to make the connection between weak solvation and low SO. So our hypothesis at this point in the study was that low SO could actually correlate with weaker solvation. And then the effects of weaker solvation, which are this molecular property in the battery, actually then affects the battery efficiency. We didn't just stop at this hypothesis. We set out to actually measure the solvation energy of our electrolytes when we reduce SO. And to measure the electrolyte solvation, we use this elegant and very clever technique developed by Sancho Kim at Stanford University that takes advantage of symmetric lithium electrodes and asymmetric electrolytes. And by definition, the relative free energy of solvation of lithium ions across these electrolytes should be related to the open circuit potential between these two electrodes. And that's defined by this equation here, where Z here represents the number of electrons transferred in this redox reaction. When we measured the free energy of solvation between the average performing electrolyte and our high performing electrolyte, as you would expect, in the case where we reduced SO, the solvation energy becomes more positive, suggesting that solvation becomes weaker, confirming our hypothesis that low SO does actually correlate with this foundational molecular property of the electrolyte, the weaker solvation of lithium ions. So with that, I'd like to bring everything back together, where I've shown today that we've demonstrated that we can actually present a new workflow for electrolyte design using machine learning that's amenable to very small data sets. We've shown that we can use this workflow for discovering new electrolytes and designing new electrolytes in lithium metal batteries. We've shown that one of the key insights from this workflow is that solvent oxygen, the fraction of oxygen atoms on the solvent, is an important driver for coulombic efficiency, as depicted here. And using these insights, we've then been able to design some high-performing electrolytes that were record-breaking at the time of this publication. We've also shown that this SO is not just an arbitrary property, that is actually related to the physics of lithium ion solvation. And I didn't do this work by myself. A lot of this work was made possible by my amazing advisors and collaborators. My advisors are listed here: Yi Chui, Stacy Ben, Jian Qin, and Jianan Bao. And my amazing collaborator, who is the co-first author on this paper, Sancho Kim, who made a lot of this work possible in combination with all our other collaborators, rather. And like Austin mentioned earlier, Constantine was very instrumental to this work, and he also was an intern at Aionics. I would also like to thank my funding sources, thank everybody for paying attention today, and I'm going to leave the conclusion slides for further discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Solomon. That was fantastic. Really, really cool to hear you talk through all this. Um, there was one question that was sort of a follow-up from the earlier set of questions we had. But I think now that you've brought it back to sort of interpretability, it's relevant again. The question was about the role of salts.
Mhm.
And in particular, our guest who's joining from South Korea. So thank you for
Yeah,
getting up so early to join us from South
yeah.
Korea. But they're asking about multi-salt electrolytes. How would you think about that?
Yeah, once you have these complicated ion correlations between all these salts, I think a lot of these simplistic features actually break down. You're not able to capture a lot of those behaviors. So I would suggest that that could be the premise for additional follow-up work where you actually hope to capture some of those effects. And one interesting and important thing to think about before you start hoping to capture some of those effects is, do you have enough data in which a lot of these multi-salt components have actually been published in the literature that you can use to train your machine learning models? Because that should be an interesting thing to consider before developing the models.
Yeah, the version of that in our solid electrolyte work was polyatomic anions were
Mm.
just like beyond the framework for our feature set, and so things like sulfates were just like the model didn't know what to do with them. So that was a similar thing where I was sort of saw that as the next frontier, like how do you featureize a polyatomic anion?
Yeah.
Definitely, it's always the exciting thing is there's always more work to do. There's always more improvements to make.
It's more work to do. And on so to that point, actually, I like the fact that you said more work, there's more work to do, because it's a nice segue to the next slide. And I think it might address some of the questions that are still left in the Q&A. In the words of Kobe Bryant in '09 during the NBA finals, job's not finished, right? We understand that these models are useful and they've shown us that we can extract signals from a lot of the electrolyte features, but we know that there are lots of deficiencies with the model, specifically along the following ends. The features are too simple, and that's a fact. We've just established that for isomers, you can obtain very similar values of these features and have very different Coulombic efficiencies. So figuring out new molecular representations that capture the differences between very similar structures is something that we should think about next. Other things that we should think about, which are related to some of the questions that have been asked today, are that these features don't explicitly contain the relevant physics. So actually using computational tools to calculate some important physical parameters in these models for these solvents is something that we should be thinking about doing in the future. And finally, these models don't account for region-specific feature dependence, and there are multiple ways to think about this. So for ethers and carbonates, the behavior, the connection, the relationship between Coulombic efficiency and some of these features might be very different because they have very intrinsically different reactivities to begin with. So designing models that capture those differences is a good starting point for future studies. Also thinking about the fact that, I think if you take a step back and think about Simpson's paradox, which is essentially it's a very simple explanation of Simpson's paradox, is that you can have a relationship at a global scale that flips on its head and reverses on a local scale. So if we look at Coulombic efficiency between 80 to 99%, the relationships that we observe there might not exactly be the relationships that matter when we reduce the cluster size and focus on the Coulombic efficiency between 95 to 99%. So these offer additional areas of investigation for this model. Well, so I saw you nodding there, Austin. I knew you were
I
going to.
have not heard of Simpson's paradox. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Now I have a new Wikipedia page to read about. Um, awesome. Yeah, thanks. So this is a good lead into Mo's question, which is where do you see this electrolyte signal being able to generalize beyond the cell conditions you controlled? For example, do you expect similar features to work in other alkaline metal batteries like sodium metal, but not necessarily in lithium ion? Um, so he says, trying to get a sense of the line beyond which these features could fail to represent mechanisms of play.
Yeah, so Mo, that's a great question, Mo. Like we said earlier, like I said earlier, one of the key steps here came from the fact that we add very deep insights into what matters in lithium metal batteries, and we're able to, in a sense, parameterize those things that matter into those features that we selected. But if you were thinking more broadly and trying to capture other classes of batteries, a few other things matter. First, you need to understand the mechanisms at play in those batteries. And the other thing that really matters that can help us generalize some of the insights from a work like this is to actually capture the intrinsic physics of the molecules that are present in the battery. And that's not what we've done here. So if you were to go to sodium, for instance, I would argue that a lot of these features might end up being important in sodium as well, because a lot of the decomposition mechanisms of sodium are quite similar to the decomposition mechanisms of lithium metal. But that would not necessarily be the case if you go to lithium ion batteries, because now you have a protective shell that houses your lithium. So you don't need to worry about this likelihood of breaking and reforming the SCI. Then other factors begin to matter in the battery. So I think you raise a good point that some of these features will extend beyond lithium metal if the underlying mechanism between the new battery chemistry and lithium metal is very similar. But if you go beyond that mechanism, then you need to begin to think about feature engineering. Now that's one of the roles of the expert in this kind of work. You can't just throw random data to a model and expect the model to do good. You need to think very critically about the physics of that system and try to capture it in the features that you select.
Great, thanks.
Is asking about the role of toluene, and we just did that to reduce the viscosity of the mixture, because as you can imagine, DBE is very long chain, so it becomes really viscous. And yeah, great question. We still observe the increase in CE if you remove the toluene from there, as long as there is a diluent that makes the DBE less viscous. So regardless of the diluent, as long as the diluent doesn't take part in the solvation of the lithium ions. So we have another example in our work where we showed, and please feel free to go read the paper, where we showed that in the presence of something like some TTE, for instance, we still observe this increase in CE as long as the solvent or the diluent doesn't partake in the solvation of the ions. But that's a great question. Good catch.
All right, Solomon, we have one final question that we just snuck in right here before the end of our time. What about dendrites? So this is from Tim again. Do you think dendrite formation is a distinct problem, or do you think solving CE also solves dendrites?
So I'm going to speak very broadly here and give you a very political answer. So in general, the core observation is that for the ICE electrolytes, you form these compact lithium morphologies. So in a sense, you don't form those dendrites. But my odd take is that it's still possible to form those dendrites without having low CE. So you can have a very high CE in a case where you form dendrites. So the other question then becomes, are there other things that we can capture in the model that reduce the likelihood of formation of dendrites, or should we formulate the formation of dendrite as a separate machine learning task? And that's an interesting question that you posed there, and it's something that will be interesting to address in future work. But generally, what most people will tell you is that for the ICE electrolytes, you don't form dendrites. But I don't agree, because it's very likely. No, if you think about it, just from first principles, you can have dendrites, you can have a passivating SCI, and you can have good electrical connection between your dendrites and the current collector, and still have very high Coulombic efficiencies, because you're not losing those dendrites due to reactions between lithium and the electrolyte. And you also have a pathway for these dendrites to be extracted during battery charging. Actually, I think there's work in ACS Energy Letters from 2021 by Lyndon Archer that actually depicts this, where if you have a nice substrate that's three-dimensional, where you have multiple connecting paths for the dendrites, you can still obtain very high Coulombic efficiencies in the presence of dendrites. But we know dendrites pose other problems, right? They pose other safety problems. So without talking too much and taking up too much space and too much of your time, Austin, I think that's an interesting question.
Job's not finished.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Jobs
Yeah.
jobs never finished.
Amazing. Well, with that, that takes us to the end of our time. So I know we're 2 minutes over, but thank you, Solomon, for this amazing talk. Thanks to everyone for joining and for the discussion. This was great. This was I think that's maybe some of the most questions we've had in one session in a while. So thanks to everyone, and thanks again for for leading us through this today, Solomon.
Thanks, Austin. This is great. Thank you.